My girlfriend laughed and said, "I can't keep pretending your one-day plans are attractive." I smiled, wished her good luck, and quietly ended the relationship right there. Nearly a year later, she accidentally saw my interview playing on the television above the bar where she was celebrating her breakup. "I can't keep pretending your one-day plans are attractive." She said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing in the shower for weeks. Casual, confident, like she'd already decided how this conversation was going to end before she sat down across from me. I looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with hurt, just looked. The brunch crowd around us kept moving. Silverware clicked against plates. Someone at the table behind us laughed at something their friend said. The city kept being the city, completely indifferent to the fact that something had just ended between us, even if she didn't know that yet. I picked up my coffee. I took a sip. I set it down. "Okay," I said. That was it. That was my whole response. She blinked. She'd been expecting something else. Pushback, defense, an explanation of the plan, a plea for more time. Something she could argue against. I'd given her nothing to grab onto. "Okay," she repeated. "Okay," I said again. And I smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. It wasn't a performance. It was the kind of smile that comes when something finally becomes clear. "Good luck, Victoria." I mean that. I left $40 on the table. I stood up. I walked out. And I didn't look back. Everyone at that table expected me to come back. Victoria expected it. Her best friend Alexandra, who had been sitting 2 tables away pretending not to listen, expected it. Even the waiter, I think, expected it. Nobody expected what actually happened next. Almost a year later, Victoria would be sitting at a bar, celebrating the end of a different relationship, laughing with friends the way people laugh when they're trying to convince themselves they're fine. And the television above the bar would switch channels. And everything she thought she knew about that morning would crack open like a fault line. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The walk back to my apartment took 11 minutes. I know because I counted. Not intentionally. I just noticed when I got home that my phone showed 11 minutes of movement, and I thought, 11 minutes to close 2.5 years. That felt about right. Dominic called before I even got my jacket off. She texted Alexandra. He said, skipping hello entirely. "She thinks you're just upset, and you'll call her tonight." "I won't." A pause. "I know," he said. "That's what I'm worried about." Dominic had known me since college. He'd watched every version of this relationship. The beginning, the slow middle, the part where things started fraying at the edges in ways I kept finding excuses for. He had a particular tone he used when he was trying to figure out how serious something was. He was using it now. "Are you okay?" he asked. Strangely, yeah. That's either really healthy or really not. I sat down on my couch. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did. Noise, movement, the particular hum of a Saturday afternoon in Manhattan when the weather is almost good enough, but not quite. "She's been saying it for months," I told him, just not out loud. He didn't argue with that. "She's going to assume you'll come back," he said. "I know. She's going to tell people you're going through something. Probably. And when you don't come back?" I looked at the wall across from me. On the desk in the corner, there was a laptop with 17 browser tabs open and a notebook with 4 months of work written in it. Notes, plans, projections, contacts. The thing Victoria had been laughing at for the better part of a year without ever fully saying it to my face. Until today. "Then she'll know," I said. What she'd know exactly, I wasn't sure yet. I had a direction, but not a destination. A conviction, but not a guarantee. I was 31 years old, sitting in a walk-up apartment in Brooklyn, with a startup that existed mostly in a notebook and a savings account that wouldn't last forever. What I had was certainty that the version of my life I was going to build had no room in it for someone who needed me to already be finished before they could respect me. That was enough. Dominic was quiet for a moment. "She really said that?" he asked. "One-day plans." Word for word. In public, Alexandra was 2 tables away. I heard him exhale. Not quite a laugh. The sound people make when something is both awful and clarifying at the same time. "Okay," he said finally. "Yeah," I said. That's what I told her too. I didn't realize it then, sitting in that apartment with my jacket still on, city noise coming through the window, everything in my life technically the same as it had been 2 hours ago, but that moment changed everything. Not because of what Victoria had said, because of what I'd finally stopped pretending I hadn't heard. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 31. Victoria was 29. We'd been together for 2 years and 7 months. which is long enough to build a life around someone without noticing how much of your own life you've been quietly editing to fit. We met at a mutual friend's going-away party in the West Village. Catherine's party, actually, which is a detail that becomes relevant later. Victoria was funny and sharp and had strong opinions about everything from restaurant reservations to city infrastructure. I liked that about her immediately. I was working in product development at a mid-sized tech firm at the time, good salary, stable enough, but already starting to feel the itch of something I couldn't quite name. New York City has a particular effect on ambition. It accelerates everything, including the gap between where you are and where you think you should be. We moved fast, the way New York relationships do. 6 months in, she had drawer space in my apartment. A year in, we'd had the conversation about whether Brooklyn made more sense than Manhattan for the long term. She had a good job in finance, social, well-connected, comfortable. Her world was defined by outcomes you could point to, titles, addresses, salaries, the kind of visible markers that make sense at rooftop parties where everyone is taking stock of everyone else. My world was starting to drift towards something less visible. That's the context. Now back to where it gets interesting. The first time I noticed something was off, it wasn't a fight. It wasn't even a conversation. It was a dinner party. 8 people, a friend's apartment in Murray Hill, that particular New York evening where everyone's a little too well dressed for how casual the occasion is supposed to be. Someone asked me what I was working on. I mentioned, briefly, carefully, that I'd been developing a concept for a B2B software platform. Early stage. Still figuring out the model. Something I was genuinely excited about. Victoria laughed. Not a mean laugh. Not yet. More of a light, dismissive sound. The kind you make to let the rest of the table know that you've heard this before and they shouldn't worry about it too much. He's always got a project, she said, smiling at the table. It's endearing. Endearing. The way you describe a child with ambitious crayon drawings. The conversation moved on. Someone started talking about a new restaurant in the East Village. I picked up my fork and kept eating and filed the moment somewhere in the back of my mind where I kept the things I wasn't ready to look at directly. Dominic was at that dinner. He caught my eye across the table for half a second and then looked away. We didn't talk about it that night, but he'd seen it. The thing about small disrespects is that they're designed to be deniable. Victoria never said anything I could point to directly and say, this is the problem. It was always framed as affection, as familiarity, as the comfortable shorthand of a long-term relationship. She'd mention my phases with a warm smile when we were around her finance colleagues. She'd ask how the app thing was going in a tone that implied she already knew the answer. When her friend Marcus talked about the firm he'd just made partner at, she'd glance at me with something that wasn't quite pity, but lived in the same neighborhood. I was working full-time during this period. The startup was a nights and weekends project, not a fantasy, an actual plan, with an actual co-founder I'd been developing it with for months. Wesley, who I worked with at my day job, had a background in enterprise software sales and had been looking for exactly this kind of product. We'd been meeting twice a week, keeping it quiet, building something we both believed in. Victoria knew about it in the way you know about whether you've decided not to check. She was aware of it without engaging with it. And the closer it got to something real, the more uncomfortable her awareness seemed to make her. I noticed. I kept moving anyway. Dominic, for his part, had started asking pointed questions about the company around this time. Not to be supportive, but in the way of a man who was trying to understand the full picture of a situation he sensed was developing. She doesn't know how far along it is, does she? He asked me one afternoon, over coffee near his office in Midtown. I haven't exactly hidden it. Not the same thing. He was right. There's a difference between not hiding something and actively making sure someone sees it. Victoria had made it clear, in the accumulating language of small dismissals, that she wasn't interested in looking closely. So I'd stopped directing her attention there. That was probably my mistake. Or maybe not. Maybe the outcome was always going to be the same. Here's the thing I kept thinking about during those months. She'd never once asked to see the business plan. Not once. Not when I mentioned working late on it. Not when I said Wesley and I had our first serious investor meeting scheduled. Not when I came home visibly wired from something going well. Not once. What was he actually building that she refused to look at? And why was Dominic worried instead of just supportive? I'm getting there. There was a Tuesday in October. I remember the month because the weather had just started to turn and I was wearing a jacket I hadn't taken out since the previous fall. When I came home to find Victoria on the couch, on the phone, laughing in that particular way she laughed when she was in full performance mode for an audience. I didn't think much of it. I went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, started figuring out dinner. Then I heard my name. Just my name, and then a pause, and then, "No, I know. He's sweet about it. It's just," and then her voice dropped, and I couldn't make out the rest. I closed the fridge. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. I didn't go into the living room. I didn't ask who she was talking to. I put together dinner the way I'd been planning to, and when she came in 10 minutes later and kissed me on the cheek and said, "Smells good," I smiled and said thanks, and we ate together and watched something on television, and everything was normal. But something had shifted. Not in what I knew. I'd known for a while, in the vague way you know things you're not ready to act on. In what I was willing to keep pretending I didn't know. He's sweet about it. That's not how you talk about someone's actual plans. That's how you talk about someone's delusions. December came, and the company started to feel real in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't been in the room with us. Wesley had refined the sales deck. We'd had 3 serious conversations with potential clients, enterprises who'd been dealing with exactly the problem our platform was designed to solve. The response wasn't polite interest. It was the kind of response where people start asking about timelines and pricing before you've even finished explaining the concept. We needed funding. That's where Jasper came in, though that story belongs in a later chapter. For now, the relevant thing is that our conversations with potential investors had started, and one of them had said something I kept coming back to. The market timing on this is almost uncomfortably good. I went home that night and thought about telling Victoria. I didn't. Not because I wanted to hide it. Because I'd stopped expecting her to meet good news about this with anything other than cautious skepticism dressed up as concern. And I didn't have the energy for that. Not on a night when I'd just had the best professional conversation of my life. That's what erosion looks like, I think. Not one dramatic thing. Just a series of small decisions to protect your own energy from someone who keeps spending it. Victoria's best friend Alexandra was not someone I ever actively disliked. She was sharp, well-intentioned in her own way, and she genuinely cared about Victoria. But Alexandra had a particular worldview, the kind built around a very specific definition of success, one measured in titles and zip codes and the prestige of whatever someone's LinkedIn said about them. Alexandra had never said anything directly to me. She didn't need to. She communicated entirely in the language of what she chose to be impressed by, and she'd made clear very early in our acquaintance that I did not currently qualify. She was influential. Victoria talked to Alexandra approximately 4 times a day. Whatever Alexandra thought about me, about my work, about my projects, Victoria was hearing it constantly, in that ambient, invisible way that eventually becomes your own opinion. I knew this. I said nothing. Dominic, characteristically, had less patience for it. "You understand that Alexandra is actively campaigning against you," he told me in January, with the calm directness he used for things he'd been wanting to say for a while. "I don't think She told Victoria that she was wasting her best years on someone without a clear trajectory. I stopped when Catherine mentioned it. Apparently, it was a whole conversation. Catherine, mutual friend, the one whose party we'd met at, had been quietly watching the whole dynamic for months. She had a better read on it than most because she knew both sides and hadn't committed to a narrative yet. "What did Victoria say?" I asked. Dominic's pause told me most of what I needed to know. "She didn't disagree," he said. Why didn't he say something to Victoria directly? Why did he keep working instead of fighting for the relationship? Because some part of me already knew. When you love someone, you argue. You fight for them to see you differently. You make your case. When you've started to accept that someone has already decided who you are and isn't interested in updating that picture, you stop arguing and you start building. I was building. February was when I found out about the group chat. Catherine told me, and I could see it cost her something to do it. She texted me and asked if I had a minute to talk, and when I called her back, her voice was careful in that way of someone about to say something they're not sure they should say. "There's a group chat," she said. "Victoria, Alexandra, a few others." "Okay. It's been going on for a while." She stopped. "It's not kind." I sat with that for a moment. "How bad?" "Screenshots of your LinkedIn. Comments about your salary. A nickname." "What nickname?" She hesitated. "Blueprint Boy," she said quietly. "Because you're always talking about plans." "Blueprint Boy. I want to be clear about something. This did not break me. I'm not telling this story as a man who was destroyed by that moment. I'm telling it as a man who, upon hearing that, felt something very specific. Not heartbreak, not rage. Clarity. The kind that comes when the thing you've been half suspecting gets confirmed in sharper detail than you expected. I thanked Catherine. I told her I appreciated her telling me. I meant it. Then I hung up and sat in my apartment for a while in the quiet. Blueprint boy. I wrote that in my notebook, actually. Right there on the page where I'd been working through our Series A structure. I wrote it, and then I circled it, and then I wrote underneath it. Okay then. The brunch was Victoria's idea. That detail matters. I want to be precise about the architecture of that morning because it's easy, in retrospect, to compress it into the moment I've already described. Her words, my response, the $40 on the table. But there was an hour before that. It was a Saturday in late March, one of those first real spring days in New York when the air does something that makes the whole city feel briefly like a promise. She'd picked the place, a brunch spot in Park Slope she liked. White walls, an exposed brick, and the kind of ambient noise that makes conversations feel private even though you're surrounded. She was already there when I arrived. She had that particular look she got sometimes, dressed slightly better than the occasion called for, bright in a performing way, like she'd come prepared for something. We ordered. We talked about nothing for a while. The weather, a show she'd been watching, a work thing she'd been stressed about. And then, somewhere in the soft territory between our first drinks and the food arriving, the temperature shifted. I've been thinking, she said. About what? About us. About where things are going. This was not the first time we'd had this conversation. In the geometry of our relationship, where things are going was a recurring topic, but one that had always resolved into a holding pattern. More time, more patience, more one day. I think I've been waiting for a while, she said. And I'm not sure what I'm waiting for. For the company, too. It's not about the company. She looked at me steadily. It's about you. About what you actually want. I've been pretty clear about what I want. Plans aren't the same as progress. There it was. That word. That distinction. I heard Catherine's voice in the back of my mind. Screenshots of your LinkedIn, comments about your salary. And I looked at Victoria across the table and saw, clearly, that she had been rehearsing this. Not necessarily from cruelty. Possibly from a genuine belief that I needed to hear something she'd been softening for too long. But rehearsed, nevertheless. I want something real, she said. I want to be proud of the person I'm with. I want to be able to. She paused. In that pause, I heard everything she'd stopped herself from saying over the past year. The dinner party laugh. The phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. Blueprint boy, circled in my notebook at midnight. I can't keep pretending your one-day plans are attractive, she said. There it was. Out loud. In a brunch place in Park Slope, with Alexandra sitting 2 tables away in a performance of coincidence that required me to believe Alexandra had planned this brunch independently on the same morning. I looked at Victoria for a long moment. I thought about 2.5 years. The West Village party where we met. The drawer space and the Brooklyn conversations. The nights I'd worked late and come home to find her asleep. The way I'd gotten quiet about the things that mattered most to me, because quiet felt safer than the alternative. I thought about Blueprint boy, and I felt something release. Not dramatically. Not with the crash of something breaking. More like a knot that's been pulled tight for a long time finally, slowly, going slack. I smiled. Good luck, Victoria, I said. I genuinely mean that. I stood up. I put $40 on the table. I walked out into the first real spring air of the year. I didn't feel sad exactly. I felt like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. I felt light. Victoria sat at that table for a while, according to Catherine, who heard about it later. She waited. She assumed I'd come back, or at minimum that I'd text within the hour. Alexandra came over, and they talked in low voices. She didn't understand yet. Some things take longer to understand than others. This was going to be one of them. April passed without drama. I know people expect drama. They expect angry texts and late-night calls and some version of a reckoning. The reckoning didn't come from my side. I blocked her number after 2 weeks of silence in which Victoria sent exactly 9 messages I didn't respond to, ranging from "can we talk" to "I think we left some things unsaid" to one that arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that I didn't read past the first line. I had things to do. The company had stopped being a plan and started being a company. Wesley and I signed our first enterprise client in April, a mid-sized logistics firm that had been dealing with the exact operational problem our platform addressed. It was a pilot contract, modest in dollar terms, but the kind of thing that transforms a business plan into a proof of concept. I remember the morning we signed it. I made coffee. I sat at my desk. I opened the notebook, the same one with Blueprint Boy written and circled on one of the inside pages, and wrote the date and the client name and the contract value. Then I went back to work. Dominic took me out for a drink that evening. "You seem calm," he said. "I am calm. Most people who just close their first client are a little more. I'll celebrate when it's worth celebrating," I said. "Right now it's just the first step of a thing that needs many more steps." He looked at me for a moment. "She messed with your head," he said. "In a specific way." "What do you mean?" "You've been waiting to be allowed to feel good about things. Like you needed someone to confirm that the thing was real before you could be excited about it." He picked up his beer. "You don't need that." I didn't argue with him. He wasn't entirely wrong. May, June. The company kept growing quietly, the way early-stage companies do when the fundamentals are right, not with noise, but with compounding momentum. The pilot client expanded their contract. We brought on a second client through a referral from the first. Wesley's sales instincts were proving exactly as valuable as I'd thought they would be. I was living differently, not extravagantly. There was no money for that yet, but with a kind of focused simplicity that I'd forgotten was available to me. I slept better. I worked longer hours, but felt less tired. I went to the gym in the mornings instead of sometimes. Victoria, I gathered from the occasional update from Catherine, had begun a new relationship with someone she'd met through work. A banker, vice president level, exactly the kind of visible marker that would have satisfied whatever Alexandra's checklist required. Good for her, I thought, and meant it genuinely. I had stopped being angry about her a long time before the brunch. What lingered wasn't anger. It was something more like the particular quiet of a room after you finally moved the furniture back to where it was supposed to be. In July, a journalist from a mid-level business publication ran a short item about our company. 40 words in a roundup of emerging B2B platforms to watch. My name wasn't in it, just the company name and a one-sentence description. Nobody in my old life noticed. Except Dominic. He texted me a screenshot at 8 a.m. "Blueprint boy is in the press," he wrote. I sent back a single laughing emoji and then put my phone down and got back to work. Why was Dominic the only one who noticed? What was building just out of everyone's sight? Because Dominic was paying attention. Everyone else was looking at the version of me they decided on. August. September. The Series A conversation started in August. Jasper, who I'd been introduced to through a contact from our second client, was a particular kind of investor. Not the loudest in the room. Not the one who made the biggest performance of evaluating you. He asked precise questions and listened with the full force of his attention, and when he was interested in something, he didn't perform interest. He just got practical. He asked to see the metrics in August. He asked to see the team in September. In October, he asked to have a longer conversation. I said yes to all of it and told almost no one, because the habit of working quietly had become so built into me by this point that I didn't know how to do it any other way. Wesley knew. Dominic knew. That was the whole list. October also brought, through Catherine, the information that Victoria's new relationship was struggling. I'm going to be honest. I didn't feel what I think people expect you to feel when you hear that. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel sad. I felt approximately the same amount of feeling I would feel about a weather report for a city I didn't live in anymore. What I felt, when I let myself acknowledge it, was something close to hope for her. Not romantic hope. Just the general human hope that people figure out what they need before it costs them more than they can afford. I had no way of knowing whether she would. I had my own things to figure out. The Jasper conversation happened on a Wednesday in late October. I'm going to tell you what he said because it's the kind of thing you need to hear from someone outside your own head to fully understand it. "The reason this works," he said, looking at our metrics, "is that you built it for the problem, not for the narrative. Most founders build for the pitch. You built for the customer. That's rarer than it sounds." He made an offer. I won't give you the exact number because that's not the point of the story. The point is that it was enough. Enough to stop doing the math about how long the savings would last. Enough to hire properly and build properly and stop holding my breath. Wesley and I shook hands with Jasper's team in his Midtown office and walked out into the October cold and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. "Well," Wesley said. "Yeah," I said. We went back to the office. There was too much to do to stop moving. The television appearance wasn't something I sought out. A production company reached out to us in January. One of those business-focused cable programs that covers emerging companies in specific sectors. Standard format. Sit-down interview, B-roll of the office, a package about what the company does and where it's going. Wesley thought we should do it for the visibility. I was more ambivalent but agreed that the timing made sense. We were about to launch a new product tier and the attention could help. The interview was filmed in February. It aired, I would find out later, on a Thursday evening in early March. Almost exactly 1 year after a brunch in Park Slope. I watched the segment with Wesley and 2 of our new hires in the office. It was strange to see yourself on television. Not unpleasant, just strange. The gap between the interior experience of building something and the exterior version of it that gets compressed into a 7-minute segment. They used a cheer-in under my name that listed the company name and my title. Founder and CEO. It looked fine. I turned it off when it was done, and we went back to the product meeting. We'd paused to watch it. I did not think about Victoria. I had not thought about Victoria with any regularity for months. I had no idea where she was that evening. No idea at all. She had no idea how much had changed. She was about to. Here is what was happening in Victoria's life during that year, as I've been able to piece together it from Catherine and from what Victoria herself eventually told me. The banker relationship, the one with the VP, the visible marker, lasted about 8 months. He was, by all accounts, exactly what he appeared to be on paper. Good salary, right title, the kind of man who made sense in the spreadsheet of a life organized around outcomes that could be pointed to. He was also, apparently, deeply boring, not unkind, just hollow in the specific way of people who have spent so much energy becoming the right credentials that there's not much person left underneath. Victoria broke up with him in February. Timing, again, is worth noting. Alexandra had remained a constant presence throughout, supportive, opinionated, confident in her read on things. But something had started to shift in the fall. Catherine noticed it first. Alexandra had started asking about me occasionally, not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of recalibrating curiosity. Have you heard from him lately? She'd asked Catherine in November, apparently out of nowhere, during a conversation that had nothing to do with me. Catherine said she hadn't. He disappeared, Alexandra said. And there was something in how she said it. Not dismissive, not the familiar brisk indifference that Catherine described to me later as like she was bothered by it. The article in the business publication, the 40-word item from July, had eventually found its way to Alexandra through some network of professional connections. She hadn't said anything to Victoria about it directly, but she'd read it, and she'd been quietly reassessing. Victoria, for her part, had started checking my social media in September. I know this because Dominic, who I had kept most of my professional presence on, had a private account setting that showed him which mutual connections had viewed his profile. Victoria had viewed his profile twice. She was looking for information. She wasn't finding much because there wasn't much to find publicly. I'd been heads down. I hadn't been posting. The company had a professional presence, but it wasn't the kind of splashy, look-at-me content that announces itself. I was just working, which, from the outside, probably looked like nothing. In January, after the banker relationship had ended but before she knew it was ending, Alexandra sat across from Victoria at a dinner and said the thing that Catherine told me about later. I've been thinking, Alexandra said. Victoria waited. About, Alexandra paused. About the way we talked about him. Blueprint boy and all of that. Victoria set down her glass. What about it? I think maybe, another pause. Alexandra was not a woman who paused often. I think maybe I underestimated him. Victoria didn't respond immediately. He's gone, she said finally. It doesn't matter. Does it not? And Victoria, according to what she would eventually tell me, looked out the window of the restaurant for a long moment and didn't say anything at all. The bar was called something with a color in the name. I never learned the full name. Only ever heard it described as the bar with the blue sign in the West Village, which was apparently a place Victoria and her friends had been going since before she and I were together. It was a Thursday evening in March. She was there because she'd broken up with the banker 3 weeks earlier and her friends had finally convinced her that celebrating a bad ending was the right move, that the appropriate response to being free of something that wasn't working was not grief, but relief, performed collectively with wine and good intentions. Alexandra was there. 2 other friends from her circle. The bar was the right amount of crowded. Thursday energy, the specific New York version. People who'd made it to almost the weekend and were allowing themselves to feel it. Victoria was laughing. Not the performed kind, the real kind. The kind that means you've actually let something go. She'd ordered the good wine instead of the second-tier wine, which was apparently a symbolic statement in her friend group. She was talking about the future in the vague but hopeful way of someone who has temporarily released the grip of whatever she'd been holding. And then the television above the bar changed channels. She didn't notice immediately. The shift happened in her peripheral vision. The screen above the bar, which had been showing something she hadn't been paying attention to, cut to a different program. A business segment. B-roll of an office she didn't recognize. A correspondent's voice saying something about emerging platforms in the enterprise space. And then a cut to an interview. And the man in the interview chair was me. She saw it a half-second before she recognized it. The mind does that sometimes. Processes the image before the identity catches up. So there's a brief moment where you're simply looking at a man in a dark jacket in an interview chair, and then the identity arrives like a wave, and suddenly you're looking at someone you know. Someone you used to know. Someone you used to call Blueprint Boy in a group chat. The Chiron appeared under my name. Founder and CEO. And then the number in the B-roll. The company valuation that the segment mentioned in passing. In that casual way business television delivers enormous numbers. Landed in the room. Alexandra saw it at the same time. Then the other two friends. Nobody said anything. The correspondent was asking me something about the market opportunity. I was answering with the particular calm of someone who has thought carefully about the answer and doesn't need to perform enthusiasm about it. Victoria, from what Catherine told me months later, didn't move for the full length of the segment. 7 minutes. She sat completely still for 7 minutes with her good wine untouched in front of her. When it ended, the bar kept being the bar. The ambient noise continued. Someone near the door laughed loudly. The city kept being the city. And the brunch in Park Slope, the white walls, the exposed brick, the $40 on the table, arranged itself in her memory into a completely different shape than the one it had held for the past year. She had believed, walking away from that morning, that she'd made a clear-eyed assessment of a situation, that she'd been brave enough to say something that needed to be said, that she'd been realistic where I'd been romantic. She looked at the dark screen above the bar. She picked up her glass. She put it back down without drinking. I didn't know, she said quietly. Alexandra, who was not a woman who was often at a loss, said nothing for a long moment. Then no, neither did I. Here's what she didn't know. Here's what nobody in that group chat knew, because it doesn't show up in LinkedIn screenshots or in salary comparisons or in the vocabulary of a social circle organized around visible outcomes. In the first year of our relationship, I turned down a job offer. It would have been the smart move by every external metric. Better title, 30% salary increase, the kind of company name that would have sounded right at dinner parties. I turned it down because I was starting to understand, vaguely but insistently, that the direction I needed to go wasn't up the ladder, but sideways off it. I didn't tell Victoria about the offer, because I knew she'd want me to take it, and I knew that if I articulated why I was turning it down, I'd have to say things about where I was actually going that weren't ready to be said yet. I made that choice in the interest of the long game. She thought, for all of that year, that the long game was a romantic delusion. In the second year, I spent 4 months helping Victoria through a professional crisis at her firm, a restructuring that threatened her position, a series of late nights where I listened and helped her prepare and was present in every way she needed. I postponed 2 key meetings with potential early-stage advisors to be home when she needed me to be home. She doesn't know about those postponements. They never came up. Wesley knew. He'd had to reschedule his own calendar around them. During those same 4 months, I missed what would have been the first serious media mention of the company, a podcast that had reached out to interview me, one that, in retrospect, would have given us visibility that we spent 6 months trying to rebuild. I declined because the timing was wrong for everything happening at home. I don't say any of this to frame Victoria as a villain. I say it because the story she'd constructed, the one where I was the dreamer and she was the realist, where her impatience was clarity and my patience was delusion, was built on incomplete information. She'd seen the notebook and the late nights and the meetings I wouldn't explain. She hadn't seen the choices underneath them, the things given up, the things defended quietly and kept moving regardless. She'd seen Blueprint Boy. She hadn't seen what the blueprint was for. The thing about being underestimated by someone who's supposed to know you is that it's a particular kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of isolation. The loneliness of being seen incompletely by someone whose full attention you thought you had. I'd been living in that loneliness for about a year before the brunch. I just hadn't named it yet. The other thing she didn't know. I hadn't been angry when I left. I know that sounds improbable, but I want to be precise about the emotional architecture of that morning because imprecision would be dishonest. I wasn't performing composure. I wasn't suppressing rage that was going to surface later in some form. I was genuinely, strangely calm. Because what Victoria had done, at that brunch, was give me a gift she didn't intend to give. She'd told me the truth. Not about my plans. She'd been wrong about those, as the television above the bar eventually confirmed. but about what she was capable of seeing, about the limit of what she would ever be able to offer me, which was a witnessing that stopped at the surface of what was already proven. I needed more than that. Not because I needed constant encouragement. I'd been working without it just fine. But because the person you build a life with is supposed to see you in the dark and believe in the thing that isn't finished yet. Not blindly, not without accountability, but with the basic faith that the incomplete version of a person is still a version worth knowing. Victoria couldn't do that. Maybe nobody had ever taught her how. I hope she's learning. The first message arrived on a Thursday. I recognized the number. I'd unblocked her months earlier, the kind of small administrative gesture you make when you realize you're no longer managing against someone. You've simply moved on. Hey, I know this is out of nowhere. I saw the segment on TV last week. I just wanted to say congratulations. You built something real. I read it standing in the elevator at the office. I typed and deleted 2 responses before I settled on. Thank you. I hope you're well. Then I put my phone in my pocket and went to the meeting I was already late for. The second message came 4 days later. I've been thinking a lot about how things ended. I think I said some things that were unfair. Would you be open to talking? I held my phone for a minute. I thought about the brunch, the $40, the spring air. I thought about Blueprint Boy circled in my notebook. I thought about the phone call I hadn't been supposed to overhear. I didn't think about these things with anger. I want to be clear about that. I thought about them the way you think about a road you used to take before you found a better route, with a kind of neutral familiarity, aware of where it goes, not inclined to go there again. I wrote back. I appreciate that. I don't think a conversation would change anything, but I hold no hard feelings. Genuinely. She replied, that's kind of you. And that was it. No dramatic confrontation. No speech. No moment where I listed everything she'd gotten wrong and watched the understanding arrive on her face. Because that was never the point. The point was never to make her feel something. The point was always to build something real. I'd done that. A call came through from a potential partner on the West Coast. I picked it up. Alexandra, through Catherine, tried a more indirect approach in April. She reached out to Catherine and asked if Catherine thought it would be appropriate to reach out to me directly, framed as professional interest in the company, as a potential introduction to someone in her network. Catherine relayed this faithfully and also relayed her honest opinion, which was that it was her call to make, not Catherine's. I thought about it for a day. Then I replied to Catherine. Tell her I appreciate the thought, but I'm not currently in a place where mixing old personal connections with professional ones makes sense. Wish her well. Catherine delivered the message. Alexandra, apparently, had no response to that, which I think meant she understood. Caroline, Victoria's sister, who I'd liked and who I suspected had a clearer view of the whole situation than most people in Victoria's circle, sent me a brief, direct message in May. For what it's worth, I always thought she underestimated you. I'm glad I was right. Take care of yourself. I replied, thank you, Caroline. That means something. And I meant it. June. The company announced a major product expansion. The announcement got picked up in 3 publications that mattered in the industry, and one that was more general business press. Wesley did most of the press communications. He was better at it and enjoyed it more. I was in the office early every morning and working through things I'd been thinking about for 2 years, finally with the resources and the team to execute them properly. The notebook, the original one, with the circled word on the inside page, was on my desk. I hadn't needed to write in it in months. The plans had become the work. The blueprint had become the building. I bought a new apartment that summer. Nothing extravagant. 2 bedrooms in a neighborhood I'd always liked, with a desk by the window that got morning light, and a view of nothing particularly impressive, and enough quiet to think. Dominic came over for dinner the week I moved in. We ordered from the Thai place nearby and sat at the kitchen table that was still the only furniture in the room, and he looked around the empty apartment the way old friends look at the new chapters of each other's lives, with a mixture of recognition and something that isn't quite pride, but is adjacent to it. Blueprint boy, he said. Stop, I said. He grinned. You have to admit. I genuinely don't. It's a good origin story. I shook my head, but I was laughing. She's okay, by the way, he said, more quietly. Catherine says she's doing better. Figuring things out. I nodded. Good, I said. I meant it as genuinely as I'd meant everything else. Victoria was not a villain in my story. She was a person who had a limited frame for seeing certain things, who had been shaped by a world that rewarded the visible and dismissed the in progress. I'd once loved her. I still wished her well in the uncomplicated way you wish well to people who no longer have the ability to hurt you. The city moved outside the window. It was a warm evening, the kind New York does occasionally, gentle and unhurried, almost surprising in its quality. "You're going to be fine," Dominic said. "I already am," I said. And it was true. The world kept moving. New clients, new problems, new solutions. The particular satisfaction of building something that solves a real thing for real people. Not perfect, always improvable, but functional and growing and genuinely useful. I started going to a guitar class on Thursday evenings, which had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the rediscovery that life is larger than what you're building professionally. I read more. I traveled once, briefly, to a city I'd been meaning to visit for years, and stood in a square I'd seen in photographs and thought about nothing in particular, and found that to be one of the better experiences I'd had in a long time. Catherine, who remained a friend because she'd been honest when it cost her something to be honest, had coffee with me in August. She asked how I was doing, and I told her truthfully. She asked, at the end, if I ever thought about Victoria. "Occasionally," I said. "The way you think about a chapter in a book you've already finished. Not with regret. Just with the recognition that it was part of how you got to the next part." Catherine nodded. "She thinks about you," she said. "Not obsessively. Just, there's an adjustment still happening. That's understandable. She's doing okay." "I know," I said. "I'm glad." The coffee was good. The weather was good. I had a product meeting at 2 o'clock that I was looking forward to. Life, in its stubbornly ordinary way, had become very good. She laughed at my future. Then she spent a year watching it happen without her. I don't tell this story for vindication. I tell it because there's a particular kind of person in the world, and you may have one in your life right now, who will look at what you haven't yet built and tell you it isn't real. They are not always wrong about everything, but they are wrong about the thing that matters most. The blueprint is not the building, but it is always, always the beginning of one.